In this video, we're reviewing Gladiator 2 and drinking like the Romans with an ancient spiced wine called Hippocras. Today, on the Martini Shot. Hello and welcome to the Martini Shot, the home of movie reviews and movie-themed cocktails. Before we get into the review, let's whip ourselves up a drink. So Hippocras is essentially spiced wine. It kind of dates back all the way to the ancient Roman times, and there's even examples of it dating back even farther than that in other parts of the world. Essentially, back then, you never really just drank wine as wine. There was usually something else added into it, whether it be sugar or spices. So if you're familiar with mulled wine, you might find a lot of similarities to this, but there's going to be no stovetop required for this one. You're just going to need a container to add the wine and spices into that you'll let sit at room temperature. And the exact recipe for this has changed multiple times over generations. The one I'm going to be using is a bit more of a modern one just because some of the spices and herbs are a little bit harder to come by for the average person. So hopefully this version is as accessible as possible and turns out pretty good. So like I said, you're going to want to get yourself a container. It can either be a tall glass like this or maybe a bowl. So first we're going to start with half a cup of sugar, followed by 2 sprigs of rosemary, 4 whole black peppercorns, 4 whole cloves, about half a teaspoon of ground nutmeg, 2 inches of fresh ginger peeled and chopped, and finally 4 sticks of cinnamon. And now you can go ahead and add your wine. You're going to want something red and a little bit more on the drier side. I went with a Pinot Noir. And that's pretty much it for now. We have to let it sit for about 24 hours at room temperature, nice and sealed. So I'm gonna be coming back tomorrow to shoot the next part of this section. So I guess I'll see you in 24 hours. Hi, it's 24 hours later, Brandon here, and we've let the Hippocras steep, and now we get to finally taste it. So take your container of Hippocras and go ahead and pour it into a new container, this time straining out all the herbs and spices that'll be left over. And as I said before, this can be served either hot, cold, or in this case, at room temperature. And there you go. Now you have Hippocras. Yeah, those spices come through very, very strong and pairs super well alongside the richness and the dryness of the red wine. I think the cinnamon and nutmeg for me is probably what's coming through the strongest, though I can still taste a little bit of that ginger kind of sitting in the back. And truthfully, it's pretty sweet thanks to that sugar. I think if you like your wine a little less sugary, you could probably even skip the sugar. But aromatically, it smells just like Christmas. You're getting the rosemary, the cinnamon, the nutmeg. It's very, very pleasant. And it just tastes really full-bodied at the end of the day. There's a lot of working components that just feel right at home inside this body. So yeah, sweet, slightly spiced. I could even maybe see this being a good introduction if you don't like red wine. There's enough flavor components to kind of ease you in, but take your mind off of the normal flavor palette that comes with drinking red wine. Who knew it'd be this easy to drink like the Romans? Now that we have our drink, let's go to 24 hours earlier, Brandon, for the movie review. Ridley Scott, the man that makes historians seethe, has been on a bit of a history kick as of late. Just last year, he gave us Napoleon, and in 2021, he gave us both The Last Duel and House of Gucci. Say what you will about the quality of those films, but the legendary director has found a way to game the industry and secure funding for a ton of films, while other prominent directors struggle to even get a pitch meeting. But for every passion project, there's a knock at the door from the studios asking Scott to revisit his past work for those sweet, sweet nostalgia dollars. It's not Alien this time, but Gladiator, the 2000s historical epic starring Russell Crowe that today is regarded more or less as a classic that even secured itself 5 Academy Awards. It's been a good 10 or so years since I've seen that, but I remember it as a pretty okay film elevated by some select scenes and performances. I didn't have time to revisit it before seeing the sequel, so the member berries aren't gonna play as big of a role here. But I have to give credit where credit is due. Ridley Scott can craft a hell of an epic. From large-scale battles to semi-faithful historical recreations, Scott has more than proved himself capable of handling scale of this magnitude. I just wish he did it in more interesting movies is all. Gladiator 2 features some stellar imagery, designs, and brutality, but lacks a strong story at its forefront. This leads to a disappointingly lukewarm lead performance, which overtakes a much more compelling performance and story that should have been set farther in front. camp. But historical accuracy be damned, the film does deliver on some decently fun set pieces that mostly do a decent job at coming off convincing despite their absurdity. I don't think it's going to overtake the original, but I don't think it's bad enough to feel completely unwarranted, though I can't really believe Scott was truly passionate enough to return to the days of Colosseums and feeling coarse sand in your hands. Set 16 years after the death of Maximus, Rome lays siege to the city of Numidia, where a soldier named Hanno has his wife killed and is taken into slavery. But this is actually the son of Maximus named Lucius, who fled home after his father's death. He becomes a gladiator under the ownership of slave-turned-stable master Macrinus, who looks to use Lucius's fighting ability to secure his ascension in Rome's government. But all Lucius wants to do is kill the general that murdered his wife. Look, I really like Paul Mescal. I think he is a fantastic actor with some riveting, down-to-earth roles under his belt. But here, as the lead gladiator Hanno, aka Lucius, I don't know, something just feels off. I'm struggling to figure out if this was a miscast or just poor direction, but Mescal does not carry the kind of gravitas you would expect for this role. He does look the part, but doesn't exactly maintain a Crow-like screen presence. He finds more success in the quieter, intimate moments, as that's what he's more known for, but his big displays of machismo don't exactly always land. It doesn't help that his motivation is pretty boring. His wife is killed, and so now he has to work his way upwards to get to her murderer. Fridging is a pretty lazy story beat that can work, but there needs to be a little extra something there, just like in John Wick. His relationship with his wife's killer, General Assayas, played by a serviceable Pedro Pascal, is given an interesting hook with him being the lover of his mother, but we never really get a lot of play between the two. Not to mention that some scenes with Lucius just fail to establish reasonable emotional weight, from his visions of his wife crossing over into death to his grappling with his imprisonment. I really wanted this to be a home run for Mescal, but it just doesn't have the legs it needed to run with. But you want to talk about commanding the screen. Was there ever any doubt in Denzel Washington? Sure, he's phoned in performances here and there, but this man lives for the Shakespearean and the dramatic, and that's what he delivers here. Washington, as Lucius's slave master Macrinus, is a total scene chewer, working his way through the Roman hierarchy to secure as much power as he can. His rise from a slave to being someone who owns slaves of his own makes for a super compelling character, not willing to try to change the societal structures that held him down, but rather harness them for his own personal gain. A slave only dreams of having a slave of his own. This is a much more interesting story that completely walks all over the main plot, and I wish it could have been seated more at the forefront. Like Lucius does with Maximus and Mescal does with Crow, this sequel lives in the shadow of the first, and ultimately, it hurts the film in the long run. It loves to call back, connect itself, and draw parallels to the first film, but all it really does is make itself look lesser by comparison. The story isn't interesting enough to really stand against the original, nor does it really make you perceive it through a new lens. It constantly hangs over the film's head as a measuring stick, and unfortunately, despite all the blood spill and political corruption, it just doesn't narratively measure up. Last week I crapped on Red 1 for being a $250 million movie that did not look like one. Well, Gladiator 2 is, for the most part, quite the opposite. The recreation of ancient Rome is crafted with both practical sets as well as mostly convincing digital effects. Except for a scene set in a flooded Colosseum, you never really doubt the legitimacy of the settings our characters stand in. There's even some animals that don't feel too uncanny, from baboons to rhinos. Speaking of which, the battles with these beasts and others manage to be fun, but not nearly as batshit as I was hoping. The bare-knuckle brawl with the baboons and the Matador-esque bout with the gladiator on a rhino are silly, but not too out there to feel disjointed from the rest of the film. That does kind of happen during a naval battle where the Colosseum is flooded with water and sharks, but you know what? I'm here for it. But this film does have an issue, which I also found in Napoleon, where it feels like Scott doesn't have much of a visual or directorial voice that has shined through in his recent films. There are some carryover elements like inaccurate but consistent accents and an emphasis on large crowd creations, but overall I just didn't find the style to be all that interesting. It certainly looks good and scenes are composed decently enough, but visual storytelling just feels like a second thought at times. Not to mention momentum just dips up and down throughout, especially when trying to juggle like 3 different parallel plots. It's not a complete retread of the first film, but it more or less hits some of these same beats and character archetypes. It really makes me believe like this was a money move and not really a story Scott wanted to tell, which that's fine, whatever, get your bag. But it makes me not want to put a ton of investment in these kinds of projects going forward. Gladiator 2 is decent fun that will satisfy most looking for an easy watch with a bit of blood and sword fights. The attention to detail and scale is truly admirable. I just wish the story was given the same treatment. The main story is bland and predictable, while stuff like Macrinus's journey felt like they belonged at the center. So was I entertained? I wasn't completely uninterested, but I did find myself a tad bored from time to time. At this point, Scott should just stick with one classic franchise. I'm dying to see more self-cessed adventures with David and his other clones. For my rating, I'm giving this film 3 rhinoceros heads out of 5. Guys, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Martini Shot. If you saw Gladiator 2, let me know what you thought about it down in the comments. And if you like what you saw here and would like to see more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow me across all social media channels. Those links are down in the description below. And if you enjoy movie reviews and movie-themed cocktails, be sure to check out my website, martinishot.blog. Until next time, thank you again for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Live deliciously, but please remember to drink responsibly.